So I just finished visiting the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum here in Jackson, Mississippi. A few quick lessons. Number one, the level of copying and the level of borrowing from other cultures is simply a natural part of life. And the movement of people from country to country, from place to place, is again just a natural part of history. There have been quite a few people moving into Mississippi. And in particular, there have been Vietnamese immigrants coming here, Italian immigrants, and so on and so forth. And every new group brings with it complications simply because change is complicated. Now, what was interesting about borrowing and copying other cultures is that I saw a stickball game that was from the Native Americans, presumably Choctaw Nation, that looks exactly like lacrosse. And given the name, you would think the French invented lacrosse, but it sounds like it was actually part of the Choctaw Nation's sports programs, or simply sports culture. The second thing is that it is, despite the fact that everywhere in the South has history. I've managed to visit 4 states in 4 days, or fewer than that actually. And part of that is because the states are so close together that when you talk about the South, you really are talking about a cohesive unit of a type. But for purposes of sort of understanding history, it's all around you. But at the same time, if you go to the tourism spots, you're going to miss out on a lot, because just like with the churches, they're no longer in the same location. They've actually upgraded. They've received federal money and they've moved. And so if you just, if you read about, let's say, First Baptist Church in a particular neighborhood, and you go there, it's quite likely that Google Maps or whatever search term you enter into or online will take you to the new rather than the old building. Now, I happened to visit the World of Coca-Cola Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was not impressed. I probably should have gone to the Civil Rights Museum that's right next door to it. But what I learned over here is that the first bottler of Coca-Cola, bottling company. Remember Coca-Cola was sold at first in diners and soda pop fountains, and then moved into bottles. And the first bottling company for Coca-Cola is right here in Mississippi. So it's not just churches in history that become divorced from their original location. It's everything, because the next lesson really is that everyone wants a piece of history, and so they want to claim it, and some do a better job of others. And I suppose one of the issues with that is the timing. So some people will tell you that the Montgomery boycotts in Alabama were 18 months. So when you go to the actual church where Martin Luther King preached, it was closed, but I was able to see through the window. It actually says that the protests lasted, or the boycott lasted, just under a year. So you go back and forth. The museum, Rosa Parks Museum, says about 18 months, and so on and so forth. And so you start to realize that the timing perhaps is not as significant as just sort of taking away the lessons from what happened. And so when you come to a place like Mississippi, one of the reasons that, the economy here, one of the reasons that the state had to be forced to desegregate was because of the economy. It was so heavily based on agriculture that, during harvest time, I'm sure anybody with an able body, including children, would be working in the fields. And that obviously conflicts with a year-round educational system. And I don't know much about farming, but I know enough to figure out that you only have a couple of times a year, I imagine at most, where you can actually become profitable, and that depends entirely on the harvest. So if you have a whole economy that's based on that, it's going to be difficult to dislodge this idea of having to choose between your children working in the fields and slaves working in the fields, and also this other pull from a movement that calls itself progress, such as education, but that does not respect the economy of the area or the economic difficulties of the area. And so one of the reasons that it was so difficult to eradicate segregation and slavery from this area was because in many cases, or if not most cases, the sharecroppers and the descendants of the sharecroppers had to choose between their children working in the fields in this hot weather, their children helping them do backbreaking labor, or having a slave do it for them. And if you have to choose between your children and someone else, most people would make the choice. Most people would choose children over justice. And that goes back to what I've been trying to say about the economy and how the economy here is not diversified as it should be. And so, you go back, and I think those are the major lessons. I also saw with the Freedom Rides, there's an exhibit on the Freedom Rides, which of course passed through here as well. Many people were arrested, white, black, students, male, female. One thing I didn't know was a lot of them were adults. They weren't just college students. They were very well dressed. And so overall, the real lesson is that because the history is all around you, it's difficult to articulate what makes this place special. And I'm going to try to do it, though I don't think I will be able to. There's a feeling you get here. It's not just the writers that came out of here. Eudora Welty, Faulkner, probably Twain at some point. And that's not just the writing, it's the musicians as well. The motto on the sign when I came into Mississippi was birthplace of the nation's music. I believe that was it. Can't really stop the car and get a sign. And that again is probably from the churches, and probably even farther back. And that sort of trickles its way up into popular culture. And you have this sort of confluence of the fact that because so much of the land is owned by a few people that have practiced segregation, that everyone else has had to work side by side, sometimes by force and sometimes voluntarily. But that commingling has created a type of its own culture that you can't find anywhere else. It's also, despite the fact that so many immigrants have entered California and Texas and so on, it also gives the South an ability to claim an immigrant mentality, an immigrant and openness to immigrants, because of the number of people that came in and from all over, trying to seek a home for themselves right here in the South, because of all the manufacturing jobs and everything else that eventually, as the state moved away from an agricultural economy and into a manufacturing economy, especially in Mobile, Alabama, and nearby as well. So the sign behind me says "a city with soul." That's a very simplistic way of looking at it. I'm just trying to articulate that there's something here that has helped people, that makes it easier to understand not just history, but just makes it easier to understand that sometimes the most valuable things are intangible. And those intangible things may be exactly the things that give rise to creativity. And part of the creativity of the South is not only this sort of battle against nature with all the tornadoes, all the hurricanes. It's not only just the fact that this place has gone through so many technological changes. Remember, somebody at one point in time in this state, and particularly in this state, had to go through, the advent of radio, had to go through numerous agricultural changes, from the plow to the thresher, all the way up to the massive John Deere tractors that you see here. This didn't happen in 3 lifetimes. It happened in perhaps 1.5 or even 1 lifetime. Along with that, you had desegregation, you had the federal government coming in, you had all these forces imposing on this place, and thereby creating a crucible that forced people to not just comply with the law, but also perhaps to get to know each other a little bit better. And it's perhaps easier to do that here now. This place also gave me an understanding of why the military and the church are so important in the South. It's not just Jimmy Carter's example. It's also the fact that if you think about it from the perspective of foreign direct investment, in other words, the military is part of the federal government. The federal government, especially under the JFK administration and the Democratic administration, the liberal Democratic administration, would be considered foreign down here at one point in time. Even the churches would be considered foreign. Remember, the Africans coming in were considered, from slave trade, were considered in a sense to be heathens, or they were Muslim. And so, because it's not, and they were not homogenous. You had a lot of evangelicals coming in. At one point, I read a sign in the museum that talked about $400,000 being brought in. I If that was money, if that was the kind of money that was being brought in, even if it's in today's dollars, I can't imagine if that was in the old dollars, but if it was, you can see again how that foreign direct investment, you have this foreign, even though it's domestic, coming in and establishing essentially an economy apart from the segregated and unjust local governments here. And that's what would give the church here, especially regarding its affiliation with the civil rights movement in some places, that's what gives the religion here so much credibility, as well as not just as a binding agent, but just as a way of bringing people together away from and in opposition to, in some cases, the local governments, and in some cases, the federal government. And so you have all these different forces coming in. The military comes in, they bring money and jobs. World War II happens right around, in this state, and it allows the black community to integrate. And again, you can see why the military would be one of the few organizations that would be respected here, because it would be, again, something apart from the local corrupt institutions. If you think about the military and the church not only as foreign direct investment, if you think of them as desegregation agents because of the money they were bringing in, as opportunity agents because they presented a different lifestyle and opportunity, particularly associated with World War II, and not the unjust wars that followed Vietnam and thereafter. You can see again how that would benefit the military's image in this state, especially when you don't have a diversified economy. And if the only way out, it's not just the only way out, but the only way that you are able to integrate is by joining the military. The only way they're able to be treated with respect is in this one organization with federal funding, and then in this other organization at a church. You can see how it would be very difficult to understand why anyone would be opposed to the military or opposed to the church. You can also see why the local governments here were so intent on maintaining the status quo. They were fighting to maintain their land ownership structure, which was very concentrated, of course. And then now, anytime you've got foreign money coming in, even if it's from the federal government, it's going to dislodge ownership here, and you're going to have competition. So when you talk about what makes a state like Mississippi so special, a lot of it is just the confluence of all these different factors that created the crucible that brought people together. And that's perhaps the best way I have to describe it. And I guess all I can say is that I'm not surprised that so much creativity has come out of this place, because wherever you have the kind of crucibles that you've had here with all the different forces that have imposed themselves on the state, it's likely that you're going to have just a different way of being.